Detroit, Michigan, autumn 1941. The night shift hums like a living machine. Rows of men in oil-stained overalls lean over glinting aluminum blocks. Sparks flare. Pistons hiss. The air smells of hot metal and ambition. At the far end of the floor, a group of British engineers stands silent, their tailored coats out of place amid Detroit's noise. They've come from a city bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe, bearing with them the blueprints of a legend, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Now, they watch as Americans try to copy it. A foreman from Packard shouts above the machinery, voice sharp with pride. "We'll build your engine, and we'll build it better." But some of the British men exchange doubtful glances. To them, the Merlin was more than metal. It was craftsmanship, precision, soul. Could an American car company truly understand that? In a corner, an experimental block shatters under a stress test. A hiss of steam, a burst of sparks, a reminder that perfection still lies far ahead. Yet in that echoing factory, amid skepticism and roaring machines, something monumental has begun. A collaboration that will one day decide who rules the skies over Europe. And soon, the world will stop laughing at America's copy. Britain, 1940. Engines screamed above London's rooftops. The Battle of Britain was not just a clash of pilots. It was a war of machines, fought piston by piston, crankshaft by crankshaft. The engine that kept Britain alive was the Rolls-Royce Merlin, a 27-liter V12 masterpiece that powered the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, the slender guardians that clawed victory from the jaws of annihilation. By the autumn of 1940, the Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had at Britain. Heinkels, Dorniers, Messerschmitts. The Royal Air Force bled daily, its pilots exhausted, its factories straining to replace lost aircraft. And at the heart of it all, one truth grew colder by the day. Britain could not build enough Merlins. Rolls-Royce was a company of artisans. Its engines were handcrafted, each part machined to near miraculous tolerances by specialists who saw engineering as art. But artistry takes time, and time was the one thing Britain no longer had. Across the Atlantic, America was still technically neutral. Factories in Detroit built luxury sedans, Packards, and Fords. Machines of peace, not war. Yet, even before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt understood what Churchill already knew. Britain needed American industry, and it needed it fast. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission landed in the United States with a desperate mission to find someone who could mass-produce the Merlin engine. They carried only paper blueprints and fading hope. At first, American manufacturers hesitated. The Merlin was unlike anything they'd seen. Its supercharged V12 design demanded precision on a scale far beyond automotive standards. General Motors declined. Ford nearly agreed, but Henry Ford himself balked at the idea of building British engines for foreign wars. Only one company stepped forward, the Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit. Packard was a proud name in luxury automobiles, famous for its quiet engines and immaculate craftsmanship. Yet its engineers were restless, eager to prove that Detroit could do more than make cars. When the British proposal reached Packard President Alvin Macaulay, he didn't hesitate. "We'll build it," he said. But agreeing was one thing. Doing it was another. The Merlin's blueprints were drawn in the cryptic shorthand of Rolls-Royce craftsmen. Annotations, handwritten tolerances, tribal knowledge passed between men who had built engines by touch and instinct. American engineers looked at them and frowned. British threads were measured in Whitworth, not inches. Their alloys had no American equivalents. Even the way parts were numbered made no sense in Detroit. Still, Packard began. The company converted its East Grand Boulevard plant into a cathedral of aviation. They ordered precision lathes, built temperature-controlled assembly rooms, and brought in British technicians to train American hands. But beneath the surface, skepticism festered. Many in Britain scoffed that the Americans will never manage it. Rolls-Royce purists whispered that Packard's version would be a crude imitation, an engine built for cars, not combat. In Detroit, Packard engineers worked through nights, deciphering incomplete drawings, translating dimensions, adapting machine tools. They didn't just copy, they rebuilt the process from the ground up. When they couldn't match a British alloy, they found an American one that performed better. When British gauges didn't fit, they recalibrated every measuring tool. It was slow, grueling, and filled with failure. But inch by inch, the engine took shape. By early 1941, the first Packard-built Merlin, officially designated the V-1650, roared to life on a test stand. It wasn't perfect. It coughed, sputtered, and overheated. But it ran, and that sound, the metallic growl of 12 synchronized pistons, was the first whisper of a partnership that would change the air war forever. Because as Britain fought for survival, across the ocean, an army of machinists was learning to mass-produce perfection, and their work was only just beginning. The first successful test of the Packard-built Merlin engine sent a shockwave through both Detroit and Derby. Rolls-Royce engineers, cautious but impressed, began to realize something profound. The Americans were not merely copying their design, they were refining it. In 1941, as Europe burned, Detroit entered the war effort in full force. Packard's East Grand Boulevard plant was transformed almost overnight into a fortress of precision. Rows of women and men in factory uniforms lined up beside glistening crankcases and camshafts. Machines once meant for luxury cars now forged components destined for the clouds over Europe. The partnership between Packard and Rolls-Royce was an unlikely marriage of philosophies. British engineering emphasized craftsmanship and artisanal perfection. One man, one engine. American engineering thrived on scale, efficiency, and standardization. Thousands of identical parts moving down assembly lines with mechanical precision. Where Rolls-Royce saw individuality, Packard saw opportunity. The Americans applied mass production methods without sacrificing tolerance. Every bolt, bearing, and valve was measured to 10,000ths of an inch. What had once been built by skilled hands in small numbers could now be produced by the tens of thousands, each one exactly identical to the last. The first official production engine, the V-1650-1, rolled off the line in August 1941. By the following year, the Packard plant was building Merlins at a pace that stunned both allies and skeptics alike. Packard didn't just build the Merlin, it Americanized it. They redesigned certain components for easier maintenance, improved the carburation system for more stable fuel delivery, and used advanced metallurgical techniques that increased reliability in extreme cold and heat. Even the supercharger drive, once prone to wear, became smoother under Packard's refinements. For the British, this meant something priceless: consistency. Every Packard Merlin was identical, interchangeable, and trustworthy. Fighter Command no longer needed to worry about mechanical variation or shortages, and yet, the true transformation of the Merlin's legacy came not in Britain, but in America, in the design offices of North American Aviation. By late 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had a problem. Their bombers, the B-17s and B-24s, could pound Germany's industrial heart, but without long-range fighter escorts, they were flying into slaughter. American P-38s and P-47s lacked the range to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Then, engineers at North American Aviation tested an idea. They took their existing fighter, the P-51 Mustang, originally built for the British with an Allison engine, and replaced it with the new Packard-built Merlin. The result was nothing short of revolutionary. The Merlin-powered P-51 could climb higher, fly faster, and, most importantly, escort bombers deep into enemy territory. With the addition of external fuel tanks, its range extended beyond 1,600 miles. Suddenly, the Allied bombers had a guardian that could fight its way to Berlin and return home. In 1943, the first Merlin-powered Mustangs reached Europe. Within months, Luftwaffe pilots began encountering them. Sleek, silver aircraft diving out of the sun. Silent until the last second. Engines howling like mechanical predators. The Packard Merlin had crossed the Atlantic not just as an engine, but as a weapon. Back in Detroit, Packard's production line roared 24 hours a day. Engines were crated and shipped by rail to ports, then across the ocean under constant threat of U-boats. Over time, Packard's quality became legendary. Even Rolls-Royce. Engineers privately admitted that the Americans had achieved something remarkable: the perfect union of craftsmanship and mass production. By 1944, the phrase "made in Detroit" carried a new kind of power. Every engine built in that city meant another squadron of Mustangs climbing into the thin air over Europe. In total, Packard would produce more than 55,000 Merlin engines before the war's end, a scale Rolls-Royce could scarcely have imagined. Those engines would power not only Mustangs, but Lancaster bombers, Mosquitoes, and Spitfires assembled under the Lend-Lease agreements, each one a heartbeat in the Allied sky. The laughter that once greeted America's copy had faded into silence. In its place came respect, and soon fear, from the men who faced its power above the clouds. Because as the war turned toward Germany's industrial heartland, the Merlin's roar would become the sound of Allied dominance. And the Luftwaffe was about to learn just how devastating that sound could be. By 1943, the Packard Merlin had evolved beyond an engineering success story. It was a phenomenon with many faces. Behind every polished engine and every victorious sortie were thousands of lives, minds, and machines intertwined in a vast transatlantic effort. To understand the power of the Merlin, one must look from every angle: mechanical, human, and strategic. The technological angle: precision in the age of speed. When Packard began producing Merlins, their engineers quickly discovered that copying wasn't enough. Rolls-Royce had achieved brilliance through artistry. But artistry could not win a global war. Precision and repetition could. The Packard team introduced standardized jigs and gauges that ensured every piston, valve, and connecting rod fit within microscopic tolerances. It was a shift from human intuition to mathematical certainty. Each cylinder was honed by machines calibrated to 10,000ths of an inch. Rolls-Royce had built about 500 Merlins per month at peak. Packard would soon surpass 2,000 per month, all identical. Detroit had turned a handcrafted jewel into an industrial symphony. But Packard's brilliance went further. They improved coolant passages to handle higher temperatures, redesigned the carburetor to prevent fuel starvation during steep dives, and optimized the supercharger drive for smoother power curves. The British engine became an Americanized precision weapon. In doing so, Packard unknowingly wrote a new chapter in industrial warfare, one where quantity and quality finally coexisted. The same spirit that had once powered luxury automobiles now powered victory itself. The human angle. The hands that built power in those sprawling Detroit plants. It wasn't generals or engineers who shaped the tide of air combat. It was the workers. Thousands of Americans, many of them women who had never worked in factories before, now stood beside roaring machinery. Their hands measured valve clearances, aligned camshafts, and assembled superchargers. Every torque wrench click echoed through the building like a heartbeat. They worked under blackout curtains, with war posters reminding them that your work keeps them flying. For many, the engine became personal. Some etched initials inside the crankcases, Others wrote messages. Good luck, fly safe. Each Merlin carried not just steel and oil, but the unseen fingerprints of the people who built it. One worker later recalled, "When I heard that engine start on the test stand, it was like hearing my own pulse. On the test benches, the engines were fired up to full power, flames licking from exhaust manifolds, the sound vibrating deep into the chest. Supervisors noted how even experienced machinists would pause, transfixed by the thunder they had helped create. Every successful test meant another pilot would make it home. Every failure was corrected with relentless care. The human spirit inside those factories mirrored that of the pilots who would trust their lives to these machines. Both groups, one on the ground, one in the sky, were bound by faith in the same roaring heart. The Merlin. The tactical angle. The Mustang takes flight before the Merlin. The P-51 Mustang was a promising but limited aircraft. Its original Allison engine struggled above 15,000 feet, too weak to chase German fighters in the cold, thin air where most aerial combat took place. Then came the Packard-built Merlin. The moment that V1650 engine was bolted onto the Mustang's sleek frame, the transformation was immediate and astonishing. Test pilots in England reported climbs nearly twice as fast, speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour, and sustained performance at 30,000 feet. The new P-51B model was unlike anything the Allies had flown. It combined long-range endurance, blistering speed, and remarkable agility. The Americans called it the pilot's airplane. The Germans called it something else: death with wings. When Mustangs began escorting bombers deep into Germany, the Luftwaffe's dominance collapsed. The Merlin-powered fighters could now fly from England to Berlin, protect the bombers, and still have enough fuel to dogfight on the return. The skies that had once belonged to the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 now belonged to the Mustang. Sleek, relentless, and powered by Detroit's precision. And with every aerial victory, the legend of the Packard Merlin grew louder. By 1944, the engine had become more than a tool of war. It was a symbol of unity, innovation, and redemption. What began as a copy had become a masterpiece of collaboration between two nations, but the story was far from complete. Because across the Atlantic, the men who once doubted America's engineering were about to witness something staggering, an industrial miracle that would bury the Luftwaffe under the weight of sheer production power. By 1944, the Packard Merlin was more than an engine. It was a strategy. It had reshaped air warfare, the balance of power, and even the psychology of the men who flew. To understand how 55,000 American-built Merlins buried the Luftwaffe, we must look at the next layers: strategy, enemy perception, and the industrial juggernaut that made it all possible. The strategic angle, power over distance. The most decisive factor in the air war over Europe wasn't just speed or firepower, it was range. The Luftwaffe had built its empire around short, intense bursts of dominance. Fast fighters, tight formations, short legs. But the Allied war in Europe depended on endurance. The heavy bombers that devastated German industry needed escorts that could fly 1,000 miles or more, fight, and then return, until the arrival of the Merlin-powered Mustang. That was impossible. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were powerful but fuel-hungry. Their range limited them to defending bombers only partway into Germany. Beyond that, near Leipzig, Hamburg, Berlin, the B-17s were on their own, flying into walls of German fighters waiting like wolves. When the Mustang joined the 8th Air Force in late 1943, everything changed. The Packard Merlin's two-stage supercharger gave the aircraft unrivaled high-altitude performance. With external tanks, it could stay with the bombers from takeoff to target, and back again. The first true long-range escort in the war. Strategists in Washington and London recognized what this meant. The bombers could now strike anywhere. Industrial centers that had once been untouchable, synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, U-boat pens, were suddenly vulnerable. The Luftwaffe's heartland was open. The Mustang became the sword that pierced Germany's industrial shield. And behind that sword was the hum of Detroit, building more Merlins than all of Britain could dream of producing. The enemy's angle. The fear above 20,000 feet. In the skies above Germany, the sound of the Merlin became a herald of death. By early 1944, Luftwaffe pilots began reporting new Allied fighters that could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin. They dived faster, climbed higher, and refused to disengage. German ace Adolf Galland, commander of the fighter forces, wrote with frustration, "When the Mustangs appeared, the air war was lost." He wasn't exaggerating. For the first time, German fighter units were forced to defend across their own skies with no sanctuary. The Mustangs arrived in squadrons of 4, sometimes 8, appearing from the sun, tearing through German formations, and vanishing before anyone could react. The Merlin's high-altitude power meant the Mustang could dive from 30,000 feet with terrifying speed, faster than most German fighters could follow. Its range meant it could hunt the hunters, waiting for Luftwaffe units returning low on fuel, picking them off on the way home. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots who once ruled Europe's airspace now flew in dread of the distant hum growing behind them. The unmistakable whine of the Packard Merlin. Every destroyed Messerschmitt, every downed Focke-Wulf meant another irreplaceable German pilot lost. Training programs couldn't keep up. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, not from bullets alone, but from exhaustion and despair. In diaries recovered after the war, Luftwaffe veterans wrote of der silberne Tod, the silver death. They knew what it meant. The Mustangs had arrived. And when the Mustangs came, the sky belonged to the Allies. The industrial angle, the arsenal of the sky while pilots fought for their lives over Europe. Detroit waged its own kind of war. One fought in factories, blueprints, and precision. Packard's East Grand Boulevard plant became a marvel of wartime logistics. In vast assembly halls, engines moved down lines in perfect rhythm, hundreds at a time, each built to the same flawless standard. Every component, from the smallest bolt to the massive crankcase, had a barcode equivalent stamped for tracking. Packard used statistical quality control, an early form of data-driven manufacturing, ensuring that not one of the 55,000 Merlins failed in combat due to production error. It wasn't just Packard, either. The entire American industrial network joined the cause. Foundries across Michigan poured aluminum blocks. Railroads hauled completed engines to the coasts. Ships carried them through U-boat-infested waters to Britain. The Merlin became a symbol of Allied unity, British design, American industry, and shared purpose, all fused into a single machine that kept the bombers flying and the skies free. In total, Packard's output supplied P-51 Mustangs, US and RAF, Avro Lancasters, bombers, de Havilland Mosquitoes, light bombers, Chargers Recon, P-40Fs and Ls, and even Canadian-built Hurricanes. Each of these aircraft carried a beating American heart, a heart that never failed. Each of these aircraft carried a beating American heart, a heart that never failed, and the impact was measurable. Between 1943 and 1945, Allied bomber losses over Germany dropped by nearly 70%. Luftwaffe fighter production continued, but with fewer trained pilots and fewer safe skies to train in, the German air arm was slowly strangled. The Merlin's power didn't just lift planes, it crushed an empire. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe was decided. The Luftwaffe could no longer stop the bombers. Germany's factories burned, its refineries starved, and its skies filled with the thunder of engines made in Detroit. The world had mocked America's copy. Now, that copy was rewriting the very physics of war. And as the engines roared toward the heart of the Reich, the story reached its turning point. The moment when the Luftwaffe, once unstoppable, finally broke. Europe, early 1944. The sky above Germany had become a battlefield, unlike any in history. Armadas of silver bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, and B-24 Liberators filled the horizon from horizon to horizon. Engines drummed like thunder rolling across continents. Below, the shattered cities of the Reich burned day and night. But in the thin air above 20,000 feet, another war raged, faster, deadlier, and utterly decisive. For years, the Luftwaffe had owned these skies. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had torn Allied bombers apart at will. Pilots like Adolf Galland, Günter Röll, and Erich Hartmann had ruled the air with terrifying skill. Every daylight raid into Germany was a gamble. Men and machines sent into a storm with little hope of return. Then came the change. The first Packard Merlin-powered P-51B, Mustangs of the 354th the fighter group, arrived in England in December 1943. They were sleek, fast, and unfamiliar, the new guardians of the 8th Air Force. When they first joined the bomber streams over France, even Allied crews were skeptical. Another new fighter? One gunner grumbled. We'll see how long they last. They lasted. And they conquered. On January 11, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched a massive strike against aircraft factories deep in Germany, at Oschersleben, Halberstadt, and Brunswick. It was the first time the Mustangs went the full distance. When the Luftwaffe scrambled, they expected the usual. Bombers alone, vulnerable, easy prey. But as the German fighters closed in, glints of sunlight flashed from above. Out of the high clouds came squadrons of P-51s, diving fast, silent until the last second, their Packard Merlins howling as they ripped through the formations. Luftwaffe ground controllers shouted into their radios, Achtung! Neue amerikanische Jäger! Attention! New American fighters! The Mustangs tore the sky apart. That day, German aircraft losses were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 100 planes, the Allies fewer than 30. It was the first real sign that the tide in the air had turned. Within weeks, the Mustang became the spearhead of every deep penetration raid. By February, they were escorting bombers to Leipzig, Regensburg, and Augsburg, places once thought unreachable. Their range made them unpredictable, their performance unstoppable. At Schweinfurt, the site of Germany's crucial ball-bearing factories, the Luftwaffe threw everything it had. But the Mustangs were waiting and hunting. They dove from above, broke up enemy attacks, and pursued fleeing fighters across hundreds of miles. In the aftermath, American bomber losses were the lowest in months. The Luftwaffe had thrown its best and lost. The Packard Merlin had done what Allied planners once thought impossible. It had broken the shield that protected Germany's heartland. By March, the bomber streams grew larger. The raids went deeper. The Luftwaffe's radar screens lit up daily with incoming raids that stretched from horizon to horizon. Over Berlin, German anti-aircraft guns thundered, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. Pilots climbed into their cockpits with grim faces, knowing the odds. For every German pilot, there were now 5 or 6 Allied fighters. Above the smoke, The Mustangs circled, patient, high, invisible. Then they struck. A German pilot named Hans Müller later described the sight. They appeared out of the sun, small, fast, silver. I had no warning. I saw the red nose flash past my canopy, and my wingman was gone. They were everywhere. We could not escape them. What began as air superiority had become air supremacy. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, new tactics, desperate interceptors, jet prototypes, but it was too late. The fuel was gone, the pilots were dead or exhausted, and the factories burned night after night. At its peak, Germany lost 1,000 aircraft per week in the spring of 1944. Numbers no nation could sustain. And behind every Mustang, every bombing run, every victory, roared the same sound. The deep, rhythmic thunder of the Packard Merlin. That spring, American generals could finally plan the impossible. Daylight bombing deep into the heart of the Reich, and soon, the full-scale invasion of Western Europe. Because the Luftwaffe, once Hitler's most terrifying weapon, was bleeding out, one sortie at a time, the sky that had once belonged to Germany now belonged to the Allies, and the road to D-Day had opened. Spring 1944. Germany's skies. What had once been the proud domain of the Luftwaffe was now a graveyard of smoke, contrails, and burning wreckage. The balance of power in the air had not merely shifted, it had collapsed. Every morning, the deep hum of Packard Merlins announced a new onslaught. Allied bomber formations, hundreds strong, crossed the channel like metallic storm fronts, stretching for miles. Above and around them, the Mustangs flew in silent discipline, their polished wings glinting against the frozen sunlight. For the first time, the air war wasn't a fight for survival. It was a campaign of annihilation. The Big Week Offensive in February 1944 marked the breaking point. In 6 days of relentless bombing, Allied aircraft struck at every corner of the German aviation industry. Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg, Gotha, Braunschweig, and Stuttgart. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them with everything left. Fighter wings scrambled from shattered airfields, emergency reserves thrown into battle. But the Mustangs were there, climbing higher, staying longer, diving faster. Every German formation that took off was met by swarms of P-51s waiting at altitude. The results were devastating. In that 1 week, the Luftwaffe lost more than 600 aircraft, many of them veteran pilots. Factories that had taken years to build were reduced to ruins in hours. German morale plummeted. In briefing rooms across the Reich, commanders began whispering the unthinkable. The Luftwaffe was no longer capable of defending the homeland. In England, American pilots returned to their bases with victory painted on their noses. Berlin Express, ferocious Frankie, Old Crow. They were young, confident, and aware of the legend growing around them. But even they knew it wasn't just courage or skill keeping them alive. It was the machine beneath them. Each time they pushed the throttle forward, they felt the Packard Merlins roar through their bones. Smooth, relentless, and alive. It could drag the Mustang into a climb few enemies could match, or dive so cleanly that gravity itself seemed an ally. The Merlin made the Mustang what it was, one ace would later say. Without that engine, we'd never have reached Berlin. And they did reach Berlin. On March 4, 1944, the first American bombers struck the German capital in daylight, something once thought impossible. The Mustangs escorted them all the way, chasing the Luftwaffe from its own skies. It was a moment of symbolic dominance. A city that had once cheered the rise of Nazi air power now trembled under the sound of Packard-built engines. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing faster than it could rebuild. Its elite pilots were gone, either dead or grounded. Its fuel reserves, bombed by the same Mustangs, dwindled to near nothing. New aircraft like the Me-262 jet appeared too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The Allies controlled the air absolutely. The results were immediate and catastrophic for Germany's war effort. Without air cover, German tank columns were slaughtered on open roads. Supply trains vanished in smoke. Bridges, depots, and convoys were destroyed in daylight, something unimaginable just a year earlier. The Merlin's echo reached every corner of Europe. It rumbled over Normandy in June, providing constant patrols during D-Day. It screamed through the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, chasing retreating forces through snow and flame. It soared over Berlin again in 1945, this time with nothing left to challenge it. The Mustang and its Packard-built heart had done what entire armies could not. They had broken the Luftwaffe's spine from the airfields of England to the ruins of the Reich. One truth became clear. Victory in Europe was not only won by courage or numbers, but by engineering, by the relentless, unglamorous, mechanical genius of men who refused to fail. The Merlin had begun as Britain's lifeline. Packard had turned it into the Allies' hammer. In every engine test, in every bomb run, in every deafening flight over enemy skies, the rhythm was the same. The measured thunder of 12 pistons striking in perfect harmony, carrying the weight of freedom on wings of steel. The war in the air was ending. The skies were silent except for the hum of Allied patrols. And beneath that silence, one question began to rise. What would remain of the Luftwaffe, and what would this victory mean for the world that followed? May 1945, Germany had fallen silent. The once mighty Luftwaffe, the pride of Hitler's early war machine, was gone. Airfields lay abandoned, their runways cracked and littered with the burnt skeletons of aircraft that would never fly again. Hangars were filled with shattered fuselages, empty fuel drums, and silence. Where once the shriek of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs filled the air, now there was only wind. The sky, that vast, deadly arena of the Second World War, belonged entirely to the Allies, and among their countless aircraft, none symbolized that dominance more than the P-51 Mustang with its Packard-built Merlin engine. It wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of a promise kept between two nations, across an ocean, in the darkest years of the 20th century. The Luftwaffe's losses were staggering. By war's end, Germany had produced over 33,000 fighter aircraft and lost more than 27,000 of them. Nearly everyone fell to Allied fire, much of it delivered by the long-range Mustangs that now escorted bombers from England to the heart of Berlin and back. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, the Luftwaffe could send 2,000 fighters to intercept a single raid. By early 1945, they could barely scramble 200, most flown by inexperienced cadets. The difference wasn't just numbers. It was fuel, quality, and exhaustion. Allied bombers, shielded by the Mustangs, had targeted Germany's fuel industry with surgical precision. Refineries in Leuna, Purlitz, and Blechhammer burned for months, strangling the Luftwaffe from within. Even if new aircraft rolled off the line, there was no gasoline to fill their tanks, no veteran pilots to fly them, and no safe airfields to take off from. The result was the total disintegration of Germany's air defense network, the destruction of an entire arm of its military power. In contrast, the American industrial machine was at full roar. At Packard's Detroit plant, the numbers seemed almost unreal. By the end of the war, 55,523 Packard-built Merlin engines had been produced, each tested, refined, and shipped across the Atlantic. Every one of them represented a triumph of logistics and engineering. Engines left Detroit in wooden crates, loaded onto trains bound for the docks at New York or Halifax, then crossed U-boat-infested waters to reach England, where they were fitted into airframes at assembly plants from Manchester to Reading. It was the perfect synchronization of democracy's greatest strength, mass production, and precision united. The British had built a masterpiece in the original Merlin, but it was the Americans who turned it into an industrial symphony. Every part interchangeable, every tolerance exact, every engine a promise that the skies would stay allied. For the pilots, the Packard Merlin was not a statistic, it was survival. Many remembered its voice, a deep, confident hum that rose into a roar when the throttle opened. The sound of life in a place where death waited behind every cloud. When the war ended, countless Allied pilots would later say they owed their survival to that engine. It was reliable, powerful, forgiving. It could take a bullet, lose a cylinder, and still carry its pilot home. As one veteran of the 357th Fighter Group put it, "That Merlin, it never quit on you, even when everything else did." On the ground, civilians saw a different story. When American occupation forces entered German cities, they found children who had grown up without ever seeing a clear sky. The constant drone of bombers had been the soundtrack of their childhoods. To them, that steady rumble meant destruction. But to the Allies, it had meant freedom. And deep inside those engines that filled the skies, thousands of American-built Merlins had sung the same metallic song. The sound that buried the Luftwaffe and brought the Reich to its knees. In England, Rolls-Royce engineers quietly celebrated, not with champagne, but with reflection. They knew what the Americans had done was nothing short of miraculous. A British design had been reborn across the Atlantic, multiplied by tens of thousands, refined and hardened by Detroit steel and Packard precision. It was an alliance that had transcended politics, pride, and doubt. As a post-war British report noted, the Packard-built Merlin maintained the same standard of performance as our own, and in some cases exceeded it. It was an understated acknowledgement, but one that carried immense weight. The laughter that had once met the idea of an American copy was gone. Now, the Packard Merlin stood not as a copy, but as a cornerstone of victory. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but the engines that had won it were still roaring, now in peacetime skies, carrying mail, supplies, and sometimes memories. Still, one question lingered among pilots, engineers, and historians alike. How had two nations, separated by an ocean, managed to build a machine that changed the fate of the world? The answer would lie not in the wreckage of war, but in the legacy it left behind. The war in Europe ended, but its consequences reverberated across factories, airfields, and the very culture of aviation. Packard's Detroit plant, once a hive of ceaseless activity, fell silent in 1945. Machines that had whirred day and night to produce thousands of Merlins were shut down, some dismantled, some repurposed for peacetime manufacturing. The women and men who had worked tirelessly returned to civilian life, carrying with them stories of precision, pride, and survival. For many, the memory of the engine's roar lingered longer than any medal or official commendation. Across the Atlantic, the British viewed the Packard Merlin not as a mere imitation, but as a savior. Rolls-Royce engineers who had initially doubted American capabilities now acknowledged that the V-1650 was as reliable and sometimes more consistent than engines built in Derby. Churchill himself referred to the transatlantic cooperation as an engine of freedom, though he never could have imagined just how literal that phrase would become. The impact of the Packard Merlin extended far beyond the war. Air strategy had been permanently transformed. The success of long-range fighter escorts demonstrated that air supremacy relied not just on pilot skill, but on industrial capacity, logistics, and innovation. Germany's Luftwaffe had been outproduced and outmaneuvered, and the lesson was clear. Mass production, when paired with engineering brilliance, could determine the fate of nations. By the end of the war, the total Allied production of Merlin engines had exceeded 55,000 units. Each engine had powered not only the P-51 Mustang, but also a range of aircraft including Lancasters, Mosquitoes, and even Hurricanes. Collectively, they enabled the Allies to dominate the European sky, cripple the German war machine, and pave the way for D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe. Veterans and historians alike recognize the significance of this achievement. In post-war analyses, American and British officials highlighted the Merlin as one of the most decisive technological contributions to victory in Europe. It wasn't the bomber alone, nor the pilot alone, that won the war. It was the combination of engineering, industry, and human ingenuity. The Packard Merlin also left a cultural legacy. It became a symbol of what could be achieved when collaboration, trust, and meticulous skill were applied toward a common purpose. Pilots often spoke of the engine as if it were a living entity, a constant companion that carried them through dogfights, over bombed cities, and back to safety. For the men who flew Mustangs, it was the sound of hope. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe faced a reckoning. Their failure to match the industrial output of the Allies, combined with pilot attrition and fuel shortages, had permanently shifted the balance of air power. By the end of the war, Germany's Air Force was no longer a fighting force, but a relic, a stark reminder that technological prowess without production capacity and logistical support is ultimately futile. The story of the Packard Merlin also served as a testament to human adaptability. American engineers had taken a British design, solved its production challenges, and optimized it for the realities of modern aerial warfare. Their success bridged two cultures, combining British ingenuity with American efficiency to create a tool that was more than the sum of its parts. And so, as Europe began the slow process of rebuilding, the Merlin stood as a monument, not of destruction, but of collaboration, determination, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Its roar would echo in memory long after the warplanes were grounded, a reminder of how a single engine could change the course of history. The sky had been reclaimed, the Luftwaffe defeated, and the Packard Merlin had written its name into the annals of aviation forever. War is often remembered through battles, leaders, and strategies. Yet, sometimes, it is the quiet, unseen contributions, the hum of an engine, the meticulous work of thousands of hands, that shape history most profoundly. The Packard Merlin was more than steel, pistons, and cylinders. It was a symbol of transatlantic collaboration, of two nations trusting one another in the darkest hours. Britain had created a masterpiece, but America's industry transformed it into a force capable of altering the very trajectory of the war. Together, they built more than engines. They built freedom. In the skies over Europe, the roar of the Merlin became a voice of certainty. For pilots, it was the sound of survival. For civilians, it was the herald of liberation. For the Luftwaffe, it was the relentless reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, could withstand the combined might of ingenuity, perseverance, and production. The story of the Packard Merlin reminds us that innovation alone is not enough. Vision requires execution, skill demands scale, and bravery in the air must be matched by diligence on the ground. Every Mustang that soared to Berlin, every bomber escorted safely to its target, was a testament to human ingenuity applied with precision and purpose. And yet, amid the machinery, there was also humanity. The engineers who labored through nights, the machinists who fine-tuned every valve, the pilots who risked everything, all contributed to a legacy that transcends statistics or production numbers. The Merlin's roar is as much about their dedication as it is about the metal that powered it. History often remembers leaders and battles, but sometimes the quietest contributions leave the deepest mark. In the case of the Packard Merlin, it was a copy turned triumph, a bridge between nations, and a force that reshaped the skies and, ultimately, the world. The laughter that once met America's effort has long since vanished. In its place is respect, admiration, and the knowledge that, in a war defined by machinery and courage, an engine could carry the weight of victory and bury the Luftwaffe beneath its relentless power.